I never planned on becoming a parent at 19, and I never imagined that the child I would raise wouldn't even be mine. But life doesn't knock politely before it changes you. It just walks in, sits down, and expects you to figure things out. My name is Clara, and for most of my adult life, I have been known as the sister. But in truth, I was also the guardian, the provider, the steady pair of hands holding everything together when our family fell apart. My sister Lily was 8 years younger than me, born when our mother was already tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Our father drifted in and out of our lives like a shadow that never stayed long enough to be solid. When Lily was 5, he left for good. No goodbye, no explanation that made sense to a child, just an empty chair at the kitchen table and a silence that grew louder every year. Mom tried. I'll always give her that. But she worked double shifts at the diner, came home smelling of grease and exhaustion, and slowly disappeared into herself. By the time Lily turned 7, it was clear that if someone didn't step up, she would be raising herself. I was in my first year of community college then, working evenings at a grocery store, dreaming small dreams like maybe having my own apartment someday. Those dreams shrank quietly as responsibility expanded. I started picking Lily up from school, helping with homework, cooking boxed dinners, learning how to braid hair by watching late-night videos. When Mom finally admitted she couldn't do it anymore, it wasn't dramatic. She just sat at the kitchen table one night, eyes red, and said, "Clara, I need help." And help turned into custody, even without paperwork. Lily slept in my room from then on, curled against me like she was afraid I might disappear too. People like to say love makes sacrifice easy. I don't think that's true. Love makes sacrifice necessary, but it still hurts. I dropped out of school. I took on more hours at work. I learned how to stretch a dollar until it cried. There were nights I went to bed hungry so Lily could have seconds. There were mornings I smiled through exhaustion so she wouldn't feel like a burden. I learned to be patient when she cried for our parents, to be firm when she tested limits, and to be gentle when the world felt too sharp for her small heart. As Lily grew, she started calling me Clara Mom by accident. Each time she did, she would freeze, eyes wide, waiting to see if she had done something wrong. I always just hugged her and said, "You can call me whatever feels safe." Inside, though, something twisted. I didn't want to replace our mother. I just wanted Lily to survive childhood with some softness left intact. By the time Lily reached high school, she was bright and kind and stubborn in a way that made me proud. She talked about college like it was a given, not a miracle. I worked myself thin to make that happen, taking on a second job cleaning offices at night. When she got her acceptance letter, she cried in my arms, thanking me over and over like I'd handed her the moon. I told her she earned it, but deep down, I felt like maybe all those years of quiet sacrifice had finally arranged themselves into something meaningful. That was also around the time she met Andrew. He came from a world that felt polished and heavy with money. His clothes always looked new, his manners practiced. When Lily first brought him home, I remember straightening the apartment 3 times before they arrived, suddenly aware of the peeling paint and mismatched furniture. Andrew was polite, almost too polite, and he shook my hand like I was someone important. I wanted to believe that meant he saw me, that he understood. As their relationship grew, I noticed the differences between our worlds becoming more pronounced. Andrew talked about his parents' vacation homes and private schools like they were normal. Lily listened eyes wide, sometimes shrinking into herself. I did my best to remind her that worth wasn't measured in money, that love didn't care about class. She nodded, but I could tell she was learning to walk carefully between 2 versions of herself. When Andrew proposed, Lily called me first, not her friends, not even our mother, who by then was more stable but still distant. She called me, voice shaking, asking if she thought she was ready. I told her the truth. I said marriage wasn't about readiness, it was about honesty and partnership, and I told her I trusted her judgment. She cried again, thanking me for always being there. I didn't realize then how much those words would be tested. The wedding planning was beautiful and painful all at once. Andrew's parents wanted something grand, a vineyard, a string quartet, plated dinners with names I couldn't pronounce. Lily wanted me involved in every decision, calling late at night to ask my opinion. I said yes to everything, even when it meant dipping into savings I barely had to help with costs Andrew's family forgot to cover. I told myself it was worth it. This was her day. This was the closing chapter of the hardest story we had ever lived. I met Andrew's father, Richard, only a few times before the wedding. He was charming in a sharp, practiced way, the kind of man who spoke with authority and expected agreement. He asked what I did for a living, nodding absently at my answer. He never asked how Lily and I grew up. He never asked why I was so important to her. I noticed, but I stayed quiet. I had learned long ago that silence can be a form of protection. The night before the wedding, I stood alone in my small hotel room, looking at the simple dress I had bought months earlier. Lily had insisted I stand close to her during the ceremony, not as a maid of honor exactly, but as something more personal. I ran my fingers over the fabric, thinking about the years that led to this moment, the scraped knees, the report cards, the late-night talks about heartbreak and fear. I felt proud. Tired, yes, but proud, in a way that settled deep in my bones. I had no idea that the next day, in a room full of smiling faces and raised glasses, someone would decide that my story was something to be mocked rather than honored. The morning of the wedding arrived wrapped in sunlight, the kind that makes everything look forgiving if you don't stare too closely. I woke early, nerves buzzing in my chest, and lay there listening to the distant sounds of staff setting up tables and chairs outside. Somewhere on the property, Lily was getting her hair done, laughing nervously with her friends. I pictured her as a little girl again, sitting cross-legged on my bed while I brushed her hair before school, asking me if the other kids would like her. I wished I could reach back through time and tell that version of her that she would grow into someone radiant, someone loved, someone standing on the edge of a new life. When I finally dressed and stepped out onto the vineyard grounds, everything felt unreal in its beauty. White flowers lined the aisle, chairs were arranged with precision. Andrew's family moved through the space like they owned not just the venue, but the air itself. I nodded politely, smiled when spoken to, and kept my hands folded in front of me so no one would notice how slightly they shook. I told myself this wasn't about me, it was about Lily, always Lily. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows and tears. When Lily walked down the aisle, she looked straight at me for a split second before finding Andrew's eyes. In that glance, there was gratitude, love, and something like relief. I felt it land in my chest like a warm weight. Whatever came next, that moment alone was worth every hard year. The reception was held under a large tent, sunlight filtering through the fabric like a soft blessing. Music played, glasses clinked, people laughed in clusters, leaning close, already loosening their ties and heels. I stayed mostly at my table, speaking when spoken to, letting Lily shine. Andrew's parents sat at the head table, Richard at the center, commanding attention without saying much at all. I noticed how often people deferred to him, how his laugh carried farther than anyone else's. When it came time for speeches, my heart began to race. Lily had asked me weeks earlier if I would say a few words. I had agreed, though public speaking was never my strength. I had written and rewritten that speech until it felt honest, without being too raw. I wanted to tell a story of resilience, of love chosen and nurtured, without embarrassing her or myself. I planned to speak from the heart, quietly, and sit back down. Richard stood first. He took the microphone with ease, smiling broadly as the room quieted. He started with jokes about Andrew's childhood, the usual fond exaggerations that made people chuckle. Then he turned to Lily, praising her beauty, her grace, how lucky Andrew was to have married up in every way. I felt a small sting at that phrasing, but I let it go. This was his moment. He deserved to honor his son. Then his tone shifted. He glanced down the table, his eyes landing on me, and he smiled in a way that didn't reach them. Of course, he said, voice smooth, we must also acknowledge the unique circumstances that brought Lily here today. A few people laughed uncertainly. I felt my stomach tighten. Not everyone comes from such traditional beginnings. The room grew quiet in a way that felt sharp rather than respectful. Richard continued. Lily's upbringing was, shall we say, unconventional, raised not by parents in the usual sense, but by a sister who, through no fault of her own, lacked the means to offer much beyond basic survival. He chuckled softly like this was a harmless observation. It's really quite remarkable what she's achieved, considering. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The words seemed to echo, bouncing around the tent, landing on faces that shifted from confusion to discomfort. I felt heat rush to my cheeks, my ears ringing. I wanted to disappear, to shrink into the chair and become invisible. Years of quiet sacrifice reduced to a footnote, a curiosity, something to be politely pitied or joked about. Richard wasn't finished. It just goes to show, he said, raising his glass, that even from humble, imperfect beginnings, with the right guidance later on, one can rise to something truly refined. That's when I felt it break. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a deep internal crack where pride had been holding everything together. I don't remember the applause. I don't remember sitting there while he handed the microphone off. I remember Lily's face, though. I remember how her smile faltered, how her eyes flicked to me wide with shock and something like panic. Andrew looked stunned, his jaw tight, but he didn't move. No one did. When my turn came to speak, I stood on legs that felt like someone else's. I could feel every eye on me, some sympathetic, some curious, some simply waiting to see what I would do. I held the microphone, took a breath, and felt the weight of years pressing against my ribs. I had a choice in that moment. I could lash out. I could correct the narrative loudly, listing every sacrifice, every missed opportunity, every night I stayed awake so Lily could sleep safely. I could make Richard uncomfortable the way he had made me. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Instead, I spoke softly. I didn't plan to say much, I began, my voice steady despite everything, but I think it's important to speak from truth. I looked at Lily, really looked at her, standing there radiant and tense. I raised my sister because I loved her, not because I was perfect or prepared or had anything extra to give. I gave what I had. A few people nodded. I continued. Lily didn't rise because someone rescued her from her past. She rose because she is resilient, kind, and determined. Everything she is today, she built herself, step by step. I paused, letting the words settle. I'm proud of her, and I'm grateful to have been part of her journey. I didn't mention Richard. I didn't defend myself explicitly. I didn't need to. The truth had a way of standing on its own. When I sat back down, the applause was quieter than before, but it felt heavier, more sincere. Lily hugged me tightly, whispering, I'm so sorry, over and over. I told her it was okay, because in that moment it was. The anger hadn't fully arrived yet. That would come later. The rest of the evening passed in fragments, smiles that didn't quite reach eyes, conversations that stumbled. I noticed how some guests approached me differently now, with a respect that felt newly earned, though it shouldn't have been necessary. Andrew's parents avoided my gaze entirely. That night, back in my hotel room, the silence finally caught up to me. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the tears come, not loud or dramatic, just steady and exhausted. I cried for the girl I had been, thrust into responsibility too young. I cried for the woman I had become, still learning how to take up space without apology. And I cried because no matter how composed I had been, something had been taken from me in that room, something tender. The next morning, Lily knocked on my door early. Her eyes were red, her voice tight. She apologized again, this time angrier, saying she didn't know her father-in-law was capable of such cruelty. I listened, holding her hands, feeling the familiar pull to protect her even now. I told her the truth, that I loved her, that what happened hurt, and that she didn't need to choose between me and her new family in that moment. She cried harder at that, burying her face in my shoulder like she used to when she was small. What I didn't say then, though, was how deeply Richard's words had shifted something in me, how they had clarified a truth I'd been avoiding. Love, real love, honors quietly and consistently. It doesn't diminish the past to elevate the present, and anyone who needs to step on someone else's story to feel tall is standing on very fragile ground. I left the wedding with my head held high, but my heart heavy. I didn't know then that Richard's insult would not be the end of the story, but the beginning of a reckoning that would force all of us to confront what family really means and who gets to define worth. The weeks after the wedding were quieter than I expected, but not peaceful. There's a difference between silence that heals and silence that waits. Mine was the second kind. I returned to my routine, back to early mornings and long shifts, trying to convince myself that life hadn't shifted in some fundamental way. On the surface, everything looked the same. I still lived in the same small apartment. I still drank my coffee from the same chipped mug. But inside, something had settled differently. Richard's words replayed themselves at odd moments, not because I believed them, but because I realized how easily my story could be rewritten by someone else if I didn't claim it fully myself. Lily called often, sometimes just to talk about small things, sometimes to circle back to the wedding as if searching for a way to undo it. Each time I reassured her. I meant it when I said I didn't want her caught in the middle. She was newly married, learning how to merge her life with someone else's, and I didn't want to be another weight she had to carry. Still, I could hear the strain in her voice when she mentioned Andrew's parents. She spoke carefully, choosing her words the way someone does when they're trying not to start a fire in a dry room. About a month after the wedding, Lily invited me to dinner at their new place. It was a modest townhouse, closer to our old neighborhood than to the gated communities Andrew had grown up in. I took that as a good sign. When I arrived, Andrew greeted me warmly, apologizing again for his father's behavior. He seemed sincere, uncomfortable in a way that suggested he was beginning to see his family differently. We ate, laughed cautiously, and for a while it felt almost normal. Then Andrew mentioned that his parents were planning a formal family dinner the following weekend. "They want you there," he said, glancing at Lily. "Dad thinks it would be good to clear the air." Clear the air. I rolled the phrase around in my mind. I agreed to go, though every instinct in me wanted to decline. Part of growth, I reminded myself, is facing discomfort without shrinking. The dinner was held at Richard and Margaret's home, a sprawling house filled with art that looked expensive and impersonal. The table was set with care, every fork in its place. Conversation stayed on safe topics until dessert, when Richard finally turned to me. "I want to apologize," he said, his tone measured. "My remarks at the wedding were misunderstood." There it was. Not an apology, really, but a reframing. I waited. "I was simply acknowledging the challenges Lily overcame. It was meant as praise." The familiar heat rose in my chest, but this time it didn't overwhelm me. "I understand," I said calmly, "but impact matters more than intent, and your words diminished my role in a way that was painful." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Andrew stared at his plate. Lily reached for my hand under the table. Richard's jaw tightened. "You're being sensitive," he said. "We all have our perspectives." Something in me settled then, like a decision made quietly and firmly. "Perspective doesn't excuse disrespect," I replied. My voice didn't shake. "And I won't accept being spoken about that way." The room fell silent. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across Richard's face. Not remorse, but surprise. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not from someone he had already categorized as lesser. Dinner ended shortly after. As we stood to leave, Richard offered a stiff nod, nothing more. In the car, Lily apologized again, tears threatening. I told her she didn't need to. This wasn't hers to fix. Driving home that night, I realized something important. I had spent so many years being what others needed that I had forgotten to define myself beyond that role. Raising Lily had been my purpose for so long that I hadn't considered what came after. The wedding, painful as it was, had forced me to confront that empty space. Over the next few months, I began to make small changes. I enrolled in evening classes, something I had postponed for years. I started therapy, unpacking the weight of responsibility I had carried since my teens. I learned how to talk about my past without minimizing it, without turning it into a joke to make others comfortable. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Lily noticed. She told me I seemed lighter, more grounded. She also told me that her relationship with Richard remained strained. He never apologized properly, he never acknowledged the harm, but he was quieter now, more careful. Sometimes silence is the only concession pride will make. One afternoon, nearly a year after the wedding, Lily called me with news. She was pregnant. Her voice trembled with excitement and fear, the same mix I remembered from so many of our past milestones. I cried, overwhelmed by the thought of a new generation, a chance to do things differently. As her pregnancy progressed, I found myself thinking about legacy, not money or property, but values. What would this child learn about family, about respect, about the invisible labor that holds lives together? I hoped Lily would teach them that love is shown in action, not status. Richard remained distant throughout the pregnancy. He sent gifts, expensive and impersonal. He never asked how Lily was feeling. I watched her manage her disappointment with grace, the way children of emotionally unavailable parents often do. The day Lily went into labor, I was at the hospital within minutes. I held her hand, whispered encouragement, and when her child was finally placed in her arms, I saw something shift in her. A deep understanding, I think, of what it means to give without guarantee. Later, as we sat in the quiet of the recovery room, Lily looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I get it now," she said softly. "What you did for me, what it cost." I squeezed her hand. I told her she didn't owe me anything, just love them well. In that moment, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known I was waiting for. Richard's insult, once so sharp, felt smaller now, overshadowed by the life in front of us. He had tried to define my worth in front of a room full of people, but the truth was, my worth was never his to measure. And as I watched Lily hold her child, I knew that whatever stories were told about our family in the future, the real one would live quietly in the choices we made, the care we gave, and the respect we demanded. The months after Lily's baby was born rewired something in all of us, though not in the same ways. For Lily, motherhood arrived with a fierce tenderness that surprised even her. For Andrew, it came with a quiet reckoning, a growing awareness of how much of his life had been shaped by authority rather than affection. And for me, it brought a strange mix of joy and distance, as if I were standing both inside and outside the circle at once. I loved that child instantly, with a depth that felt familiar and new all at the same time. But I was no longer the center of Lily's world, and that was exactly how it should be. Still, becoming an aunt in name only didn't erase the habits of a lifetime. I showed up with meals, folded laundry without being asked, held the baby through long afternoons so Lily could sleep. Andrew thanked me often, sometimes with words that felt heavier than politeness. Once, while Lily was napping, he said quietly, "I don't think I understood what you gave up. Not really. Until now." I nodded, not because I needed his acknowledgement, but because it mattered that he was learning. Richard, on the other hand, hovered at a distance. He visited, but briefly. He held his grandchild awkwardly, like someone afraid of doing it wrong, and then handed them back quickly. He spoke more to Andrew than to Lily, more to the idea of family than to the people actually living it. I watched him carefully, not with bitterness anymore, but with curiosity. I wondered what kind of wounds made a man confuse control with care. The real turning point came one afternoon when Lily called me in tears. Richard had criticized her parenting, suggesting she was being overly emotional and too permissive, implying that structure mattered more than presence. The words cut deeper than he probably intended, reopening old doubts Lily thought she had outgrown. I listened, letting her cry, letting the silence stretch until she could breathe again. That evening, I did something I hadn't planned. I drove to Richard's house alone. He looked surprised when he opened the door, as if the idea of me arriving without warning disrupted the order of his world. We sat in his immaculate living room, the air between us tight but clear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I spoke plainly. "You don't get to undermine her," I said. "Not after what she survived, not after what she's building." Richard leaned back, folding his arms. "I'm offering guidance." "No," I replied, "you're repeating a pattern, one where authority matters more than understanding." He bristled. "You're overstepping." I met his gaze. "I stepped up when no one else did. That doesn't end because she's married or a mother now." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, his shoulders sagged just slightly. "I didn't have that," he said, almost to himself. "No one stepped up for me." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to honesty I had heard from him. "I know," I said gently, "but that doesn't mean you get to pass the hurt along." When I left that night, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired, but lighter. Some battles aren't about winning. They're about drawing a line and refusing to erase it for anyone else's comfort. Over time, things shifted, slowly, imperfectly. Richard became quieter with his opinions. He watched more, listened a little longer. Once, months later, he surprised me by asking how Lily had been as a child, not in a dismissive way, but with genuine curiosity. I told him a few small stories. I didn't soften the hard parts, but I didn't weaponize them either. I saw something change in his eyes then, a recognition that resilience isn't accidental. It's cultivated by someone choosing to stay. As for me, my life continued to expand in ways I hadn't imagined when I was 19 and scared. I finished my degree, I changed careers, I learned how to rest without guilt, how to say no without explanation. Therapy taught me that love doesn't require self-erasure and that boundaries aren't walls, but doors you get to open selectively. One evening, years after the wedding, Lily and I sat on her porch watching her child play in the yard. The air was warm, the moment unremarkable in the best way. She turned to me and said, "I want them to know where they come from, the real story." I smiled. "They will," I said. "You'll tell it." She shook her head. "No, we will." In that moment, I understood something deeply. My role hadn't ended when Lily married. It had simply transformed. I wasn't needed in the same way, but I was still part of the foundation. And this time, I wasn't carrying it alone. Looking back now, I see the wedding insult not as the climax of my pain, but as the catalyst for my clarity. It forced me to stop shrinking my story to fit into rooms that were never built to hold it. It taught me that dignity isn't granted by recognition, but claimed through self-respect. And it reminded me that the quiet work of love, though often overlooked, leaves echoes that outlast any public insult. I raised my sister alone, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but with everything I had. And when someone tried to reduce that to a joke, I learned that I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to stand still in the truth. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges. But it also has a way of sharpening understanding. As the years moved forward, the wedding felt farther away, yet its lessons stayed close. I noticed how often people tried to simplify my relationship with Lily, calling me just her sister, or conversely, praising me in ways that felt uncomfortable, like I had done something heroic rather than necessary. I learned to let those comments pass without correcting them. The truth didn't need constant defense anymore. It lived in how we moved through the world together. Lily grew into motherhood with a confidence that was earned, not assumed. She made mistakes, questioned herself, learned, and adjusted. I watched her choose gentleness even when impatience would have been easier. Sometimes she called me late at night, exhausted, asking how I had done it all those years. I laughed softly and told her the truth. I didn't always do it well, I said. I just didn't quit. Andrew changed too. Becoming a father peeled back layers he hadn't known were there. He spoke more openly about his childhood, about the pressure to perform, to achieve, to never show weakness. One night, after Lily and the baby had gone to sleep, he and I sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet around us. He thanked me again, this time without apology or defensiveness. "I see now," he said, voice low, "that family isn't about who provides the most. It's about who stays." Those words stayed with me. Richard remained a complicated presence. He never became warm or openly affectionate, but he softened in subtle ways. He started attending birthdays without making speeches. He asked Lily's child about school, about interests, listening instead of lecturing. Once, during a family gathering, I caught him watching me across the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. Later, as I was preparing to leave, he stopped me. "I was wrong," he said quietly. It wasn't a full apology. He didn't mention the wedding or the pain he caused, but it was enough. It was an acknowledgement, and sometimes that's as much as pride will allow. I nodded. "Thank you," I replied, and I meant it. Not because it erased the past, but because it showed movement. As my own life expanded, I found space for things I had long postponed. I traveled modestly, savoring small freedoms like choosing where to go and when to return. I cultivated friendships that were mutual, not dependent. I learned how to receive care as readily as I gave it. For the first time, my identity wasn't anchored solely to what I provided for others. There were moments of grief in that, too. Letting go of a role, even one born of necessity, means mourning the version of yourself who survived it. I allowed myself to feel that sadness without judgment. Healing, I learned, isn't about erasing the past. It's about integrating it without letting it define every step forward. On the anniversary of Lily's wedding, years later, we sat together looking through old photos. She paused on one of us standing side by side just after the ceremony. "She wished things had been different," she said softly. "They were exactly what they needed to be," I replied. "They taught us what mattered." She leaned her head on my shoulder, a familiar gesture from long ago. In that moment, I felt the full circle of our story, from two scared girls in a small apartment to two women who had built something resilient and real. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's this: sacrifice doesn't need an audience to be meaningful, but it deserves respect. And when that respect is denied, it's okay to step into your own worth and speak, quietly, firmly, without apology. I once thought my greatest achievement was raising my sister alone. Now I understand that my greatest achievement was learning to value myself beyond that role. The wedding insult, painful as it was, became the mirror I didn't know I needed. It showed me how much I had given and how much I still deserved. Family isn't defined by blood or ceremony or speeches made in front of a crowd. It's defined by who shows up when it's hard, who stays when it's inconvenient, and who learns to honor the unseen labor that makes love possible. And if you ever find yourself standing in a room where someone tries to rewrite your story for their comfort, remember this: you don't owe them a performance. You owe yourself the truth. As the years layered themselves gently over everything that came before, I began to notice how often people tried to place our story into neat categories: struggle, sacrifice, triumph. They wanted it to make sense quickly, to fit into something inspirational and tidy. But real life doesn't arrange itself that way. It lingers in the in-between spaces, in the moments that don't photograph well or translate cleanly into words. And it was in those quieter stretches that I learned the most about who I had become after the wedding, after the insult, after the long season of redefining myself. Lily's child grew quickly, as children do, unfolding into their own small person with preferences and opinions. They called me Aunt Clara, but sometimes, when they were tired or upset, they would reach for me the way Lily once had, instinctively, as if my presence meant steadiness. The first time it happened, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, followed by something new. Not fear, not obligation, just love, free of the weight it once carried. I could offer comfort without carrying the full burden of responsibility, and that distinction mattered more than I expected. Richard noticed too. One afternoon, after dropping her child off with me so she and Andrew could attend a work event, she lingered by the door. "You're different," she said, not accusing, just observing, in a good way. I smiled. "So are you." She nodded slowly. I think we both finally get to just be." That word stayed with me. Be. For so long, my identity had been wrapped in doing enough, doing more, doing whatever was required to keep us afloat. Learning to simply be felt like learning a new language, one that didn't rely on urgency or sacrifice as proof of worth. Around that time, I was invited to speak at a small community event about non-traditional families. I hesitated before agreeing. Part of me worried about reopening old wounds, about standing in front of strangers and distilling decades of lived experience into something consumable. But another part of me recognized an opportunity, not to perform resilience, but to speak honestly about it. When I stood at the podium, I didn't dramatize my story. I spoke plainly about raising my sister, about loving without guarantees, about the quiet ways people judge what they don't understand. I talked about the wedding, though not in detail. I mentioned the insult not as a grievance, but as a turning point, a moment that forced me to see how easily dignity can be overlooked when sacrifice is invisible. Afterward, a woman approached me, tears in her eyes. She told me she had raised her grandchildren and had never felt seen for it. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it out loud." That's when I understood something I hadn't before. My story wasn't just mine. It was shared by so many people who had stepped into roles they didn't plan for and carried them quietly, without applause. Speaking about it wasn't indulgent, it was necessary. Richard attended one of Lily's family gatherings not long after that event. He was older now, his movements slower, his voice less commanding. At some point in the evening, he pulled me aside. "He heard you spoke somewhere," he said. "Yes," I replied, waiting. He cleared his throat. "I watched a recording. Lily sent it." That surprised me. "And?" He hesitated. "You spoke well, honestly." I thanked him, genuinely. There was no tension in the exchange, no unspoken battle, just two people acknowledging a truth that had taken a long time to surface. I realized then that reconciliation doesn't always look like warmth or closeness. Sometimes it looks like mutual recognition and leaving the rest untouched. As Lily's child grew older, they began asking questions, simple ones at first. Why didn't Aunt Clara have kids? Why did Mom live with Aunt Clara when she was little? Lily answered as best she could, always looping me in, always careful to present our past without shame. One evening, after a particularly curious round of questions, Lily's child climbed into my lap and asked, "Did you take care of my mom?" "Yes," I said softly. They thought about that for a moment, then said, "You're really brave." I laughed, a little off guard. "I don't know about brave." They shrugged. "I think you are." Children have a way of seeing truth without overthinking it. In that moment, I felt something settle that I hadn't known was still restless. Not pride exactly, more like peace. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Lily and I sat together in the quiet. "I worry sometimes," she admitted, "that you gave up too much for me." I took a breath. "I did give up things," I said honestly, "but I also gained things I wouldn't trade. And the important part is that I don't live in that trade anymore. I chose what came next." She nodded, eyes shining. "I want to make sure my child knows that love shouldn't cost you your whole self." That's a good lesson, one I had to learn the long way. As time went on, the wedding story became something we referenced less often, not because it had lost significance, but because it had completed its work. It had cracked something open, forced growth, and then gently receded into the background, where lessons often belong. When I thought back on it, I no longer felt the sharp sting of humiliation. I felt gratitude for the clarity it brought, even if it arrived through pain. I had learned how to hold my head high without needing validation, how to let people misunderstand me without rushing to correct them, how to protect my peace without cutting myself off from connection. These weren't skills I picked up overnight. They were built slowly, the same way I had built a life for Lily all those years ago, with patience, with repetition, with care. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I came across a stack of notes Lily had written me as a child. "Thank you for dinner. I'm sorry I was mean. I love you." I sat on the floor and read them all, tears slipping down my face. Not from sadness, but from recognition. I had done something meaningful, not flawless, not celebrated, but real. And that, I finally understood, was enough. As Lily's child grew older, the questions became more layered, less about what happened and more about why. Why families look different, why some people live together out of love instead of obligation, why adults sometimes argue quietly behind closed doors and then come back out smiling like nothing happened. Lily handled those questions with a steadiness that made me proud, but I could tell there were moments when she reached for me, not as a crutch, but as a mirror. We had both grown, but our shared history still grounded us. One evening, after a long family dinner, Lily walked me to my car. The sky was dark and warm, the kind of night that invites honesty. She leaned against the door, arms folded, and said, "I've been thinking about Dad." She meant Richard. Even now, she still used the word carefully. "I know he'll never be the kind of grandfather who gets on the floor and plays," she continued, "but I think he's trying in the only way he knows how." I nodded. "Trying doesn't always look the way we want it to." She sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm married into a family that will always feel a little foreign." "That doesn't mean you don't belong," I said gently. "It just means you get to decide what you carry forward and what you leave behind." She smiled at that, the tension easing slightly. "You always say things like that," she said, "like you've already lived 10 lifetimes." I laughed. "Maybe I just paid attention during the hard parts." Richard's health began to decline not long after. Nothing dramatic at first, small things. Fatigue, missed gatherings, a quieter presence when he did attend. It shifted the balance of the family in subtle ways. Margaret became more vocal, more anxious. Andrew took on more responsibility, and with it came a tenderness I hadn't seen before. Illness has a way of rearranging priorities, of exposing what really matters beneath the layers of pride. One afternoon, Andrew called me directly. That alone told me something was different. "Dad wants to talk to you," he said, sounding unsure. "He asked for you." I took a long breath before agreeing. When I arrived at Richard's house, it felt smaller somehow, less imposing. He sat in his favorite chair, thinner now, his voice softer. We spoke at first about neutral things, the weather, Lily's child. Then, after a pause that stretched just long enough to matter, he said, "I owe you more than I gave." I didn't interrupt. I spent most of my life believing provision was love, that control was responsibility. I thought if I built enough, earned enough, demanded enough, everything would be fine. He looked at his hands. I was wrong. The room felt very still. "When I spoke at the wedding," he said, "I wasn't trying to hurt you, but I was trying to place myself above something I didn't understand, and that says more about me than it ever did about you." This time it was an apology, not perfect, not polished, but real. I felt emotion rise, but it didn't overwhelm me. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That matters." He nodded. "You did what I never learned how to do. You stayed, you adapted, you loved without leverage." He swallowed. "That deserves respect." When I left that house, I didn't feel closure in a dramatic sense. I felt something gentler, resolution. Not everything needs to be healed loudly. Some things just need to be acknowledged so they can rest. Later that week, Lily called me crying again, but this time the tears were different. "He said he's proud of me," she whispered. "He's never said that before." I smiled through my own tears. "I'm glad," I said, and I meant it for both of them. As years continued to pass, I became something of a quiet anchor in our extended family, not the loudest voice, not the most authoritative, but someone people turned to when things felt uncertain. I didn't offer advice unless asked. I had learned that presence often mattered more than answers. I also began mentoring younger women in my community, many of whom were stepping into caregiving roles far too early. I didn't glamorize it. I told them the truth, that love can be sustaining, but it shouldn't erase you, that asking for help isn't weakness, that boundaries are an act of care, not rejection. Watching them listen, nod, sometimes cry, reminded me of how far I had come from the girl who thought endurance was the same as strength. One afternoon, Lily's child came home from school with a drawing. It showed 3 figures holding hands. "That's me, Mom, and Aunt Clara," they explained proudly. Lily laughed, but I felt my throat tighten. Even now, even after everything had shifted, the essence of our bond remained visible, simple, undeniable. That night, Lily and I talked about the wedding again for the first time in a long while. Not with anger, not with pain, but with perspective. "I think that was the first time I really saw you as your own person," she admitted. "Not just my protector, but someone who deserved protecting too." I nodded. That was the first time I realized I needed to see myself that way. Silence settled between us, comfortable and full, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have survived together. Looking back now, I understand that the insult at the wedding was never really about me. It was about a worldview that couldn't comprehend quiet sacrifice, that only valued what could be displayed or inherited. Standing in that room, choosing dignity over retaliation, changed the direction of my life in ways I couldn't have predicted. It taught me I didn't need to earn my place by enduring disrespect. I could simply refuse it. I raised my sister alone. That truth will always be part of me, but it is no longer the only thing that defines me. I am a woman who learned to step out of the shadows of necessity and into the light of self-worth. I am someone who understands that family is not about hierarchy, but about care. And I am someone who knows that even the quietest stories deserve to be told with honor. As Lily's child moved into their teenage years, I watched the world widen for them in ways both exciting and frightening. They asked sharper questions now, not just about family, but about fairness, about power, about why some voices seemed to matter more than others. Sometimes those questions came home tangled with frustration from school or friends, and Lily would call me afterward, asking how to guide without controlling. I recognized that tension immediately. It was the same one I had carried for years, trying to protect without imprisoning, to support without disappearing. One evening, Lily's child sat with me on the porch as the sun dipped low. They were quiet for a long time before finally saying, "Grandpa Richard scares me a little. Not in a dramatic way, just honest." "Why?" I asked gently. They shrugged. "He's not mean. He just talks like he knows everything, like there's a right way to be a person." I smiled softly. "A lot of people grow up thinking that." They looked at me, curious. "Did you?" "No," I said after a pause. "I grew up thinking there was only one way to survive. It took me a long time to learn there are many ways to live." They nodded, absorbing that. Moments like that reminded me how influence doesn't always come from authority. Sometimes it comes from consistency, from being someone who listens without rushing to correct. Richard's health continued to decline, slowly but unmistakably. He became more reflective, less guarded. During one visit, he asked me about my childhood, something he had never done before. I told him about the nights Lily and I slept in the same bed because the heat had been shut off, about learning to read utility bills before I learned how to drive, about the quiet fear of not knowing if love would be enough. He listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past me, as if seeing something he had avoided for decades. When I finished, he said, "I spent my life afraid of chaos. I thought control would save us from it." He shook his head. "But you lived in chaos and still found care." I didn't respond right away. Some truths don't need answers. They just need space. After that conversation, Richard treated me differently, not deferentially, not warmly, but with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. He asked my opinion sometimes. He listened when I spoke. And when he eventually passed, quietly, surrounded by family, I felt a complicated grief, not just for the man he was, but for the man he might have been if he had learned earlier what love without conditions looked like. At his memorial, Andrew spoke about legacy, about how his father had built things that would last, businesses, properties, a name. When Lily spoke, she talked about lessons, about learning when to lead and when to listen. And when I was asked to say a few words, I hesitated, then stood. I believe legacy isn't just what we leave behind, it's what we change while we're here. Richard changed, slowly, imperfectly, but meaningfully, and that matters. Afterward, Lily hugged me tightly. "You gave him dignity," she whispered. I thought back to the wedding, to the way dignity had been denied so casually, so publicly. How strange and fitting that years later I was the one offering it, freely, without being asked. Life moved forward as it always does. Lily's child left for college, standing on the same threshold Lily once had, though under far different circumstances. This time there was no fear of being left behind, only pride, only trust. I helped them pack, slipping a small envelope into their bag. Inside was a letter I had written, not full of advice, but reassurance that they were loved, that they didn't have to earn belonging, that home was not a place, but a relationship. After they left, Lily cried in my kitchen the way she used to cry in our old apartment. "You forget I didn't do it twice. I did it once, and then I learned to let go." She laughed through tears. "I'm still learning that part." Aren't we all? As I grew older, my life settled into a rhythm that felt earned. I spent mornings reading, afternoons volunteering, evenings walking through my neighborhood, noticing small things I once rushed past. I stayed connected, but no longer entangled. I loved deeply, but with room to breathe.
Sometimes people asked me if I regretted anything, if I wished my life had been different. I always thought carefully before answering. Regret is easy to romanticize, but it ignores context. I didn't choose hardship, but I chose response, and that choice shaped everything. When I think back to that wedding now, I no longer see a room full of judgmental eyes. I see a turning point, a moment when my story tried to slip out of my hands and into someone else's narrative, and I quietly took it back. Not with anger, not with spectacle, but with truth. If there is a moral in all of this, it's not that sacrifice makes you noble or that endurance guarantees respect. It's that your worth exists whether or not anyone recognizes it. And when recognition doesn't come, you are still allowed to stand tall. I raised my sister alone. I was insulted in public. I was underestimated, dismissed, misunderstood, and still I built a life rooted in care, honesty, and self-respect. That is not a story of revenge. It's a story of reclamation. And it continues quietly every day I choose to live fully, without shrinking, without apology, and without letting anyone decide what my love was worth.
As the years stretched onward, I began to understand that healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves, some gentle, some unexpected, some that knock the breath out of you even when you think you're done swimming. Richard's passing closed one chapter, but it opened another in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without his presence, the family dynamic shifted again, quieter and less tense, but also strangely hollow. Power vacuums don't just exist in politics, they exist in families too. Margaret retreated into herself after his death, unsure of who she was without the role of wife to a commanding man. Andrew struggled in his own way, grieving not just the father he had, but the father he wished he could have had sooner. Lily, steady as ever, tried to hold space for everyone while still protecting her own peace. I watched all of this with a familiar instinct rising in me, the urge to step in, to manage, to fix. But this time, I didn't. That was one of the hardest lessons to live out, knowing when to help and when to step back, knowing that support doesn't always mean sacrifice. I checked in, I listened, I showed up when invited, and when I felt that old pull to overextend, I paused and asked myself a simple question: is this mine to carry? Most of the time, the answer was no. One afternoon, Margaret asked to meet me for lunch. We had never been close, not truly. Our conversations had always been polite, measured, orbiting around shared connections rather than shared understanding. Sitting across from her in that quiet cafe, I noticed how much smaller she seemed, how the sharpness had softened into something fragile. "I don't know how to do this alone," she admitted, stirring her tea even after the sugar had dissolved. I recognized the fear in her voice immediately. It was the same fear my mother had carried years ago, the fear of being untethered. "You don't have to do it all at once," I said gently. "You just have to take the next step." She looked at me, eyes glistening. "You're very good at that." I smiled faintly. I had a lot of practice. Over time, Margaret began reaching out more, not for guidance exactly, but for companionship. We walked together occasionally, spoke about books, about aging, about the strange recalibration that happens when life doesn't look the way you expected. In those conversations, I saw how easily people are shaped by the roles they inhabit for too long. It softened my judgments, even as it reinforced my boundaries. Lily's child came home from college changed, as young adults often do, more opinionated, more self-assured. They spoke openly about injustice, about chosen family, about redefining success. One evening, while helping me wash dishes, they said, "You know, Aunt Clara, our family doesn't make sense to everyone, but I like that." I laughed. "So do I." "It feels honest," they continued, "like no one's pretending." That might have been the highest compliment they could give. Lily and I talked later that night about generational shifts, about how each generation gets a chance to loosen the grip of what came before. You gave me something I didn't even know to ask for, a model for love that doesn't dominate. I thought about that for a long time after she left. Love that doesn't dominate. That might be the truest summary of everything I had learned. There were moments, of course, when old doubts resurfaced, quiet nights when I wondered what my life might have looked like if I hadn't stepped into responsibility so young, if I had finished school earlier, if I had traveled more, loved differently. Those thoughts didn't haunt me the way they once had, but they still visited from time to time. I learned to greet them without letting them stay too long. Regret loses its power when you stop arguing with it. One evening, while organizing old paperwork, I found the speech I had written for Lily's wedding, the original one, the version I never gave. I read it slowly, noticing how careful I had been not to take up too much space even then, how I had framed my role as incidental, almost invisible. I folded the pages and set them aside, not with sadness, but with understanding. That version of me had done the best she could with what she knew. I no longer needed her armor. Later that year, Lily invited me to speak at her child's graduation party. Just a few words, she said, nothing formal. As I stood in front of friends and family, I looked at the faces gathered there, at the ease with which love moved through the room. I spoke briefly, honestly, about pride, about resilience, about the quiet strength it takes to become yourself in a world that often tries to label you early. Afterward, Lily hugged me and whispered, "You sound free." I was. Freedom, I learned, isn't about having no obligations. It's about choosing them consciously. It's about knowing when your giving comes from love and when it comes from fear. It's about standing in rooms where you were once diminished and realizing they no longer have the power to define you. The wedding insult that once felt like a wound now felt like a marker on a long road, a signpost that read, "This is where you stopped shrinking. This is where you began to live differently." I didn't need revenge. I didn't need public vindication. I needed alignment, and I found it, slowly, patiently, through years of choosing myself alongside the people I loved. If you're listening to this and carrying a story that's been minimized, misunderstood, or mocked, I hope you know this. You don't need to rewrite your past to justify your worth. You only need to claim your present with honesty and care. The rest will follow. There's a quiet moment that comes after a long season of growth, when nothing dramatic is happening and no one is watching. That's where I find myself now. Not at the center of a celebration, not recovering from a wound, just living. And for the first time in my life, that feels like enough. I wake up most mornings without urgency. I make my coffee slowly. I sit by the window and watch the light move across the floor. These small rituals would have felt impossible to my younger self, who lived by alarms and responsibilities and the constant awareness that if I stopped moving, everything might fall apart. Back then, rest felt dangerous. Now it feels earned. Lily and I still talk often, though not with the intensity we once shared when survival bound us tightly together. Our conversations are lighter now, filled with observations and laughter, with shared memories that no longer sting. Sometimes we revisit the hard years, but we do it gently, like turning over stones that no longer cut our hands. We honor what we lived without letting it pull us backward. Her child, now standing firmly on the edge of adulthood, comes to me for different reasons than Lily once did. They don't need protection, they need perspective. They ask about choices, about what matters when the world feels loud and demanding. I never tell them what to do. I tell them stories instead. Not lessons disguised as advice, but lived moments that show how values are revealed through action. I trust them to draw their own conclusions. One afternoon, they asked me directly, "Do you think people can really change?" I thought about Richard, about the man he was at the wedding, about the man he became near the end. "Yes," I said finally, "but only if they're willing to look honestly at themselves. And even then, change doesn't erase harm, it just alters what comes next." They nodded, thoughtful. "I'm glad you didn't let him define you." "So am I," I replied. That's the thing about moments like the wedding. At the time, they feel enormous, like they might swallow everything else. But with distance, you realize they are crossroads, not endings. You don't always get to choose what happens to you, but you do get to choose what you carry forward. For a long time, I carried my story like proof that I was strong, proof that I was capable, proof that I deserved to belong. I don't carry it that way anymore. Now I carry it like context. It explains me, but it doesn't confine me. Every so often, someone new will hear a version of what I did for Lily and say, "I don't know how you managed that." I smile and tell them the truth. I didn't manage it all at once. I just kept choosing love over fear. That answer surprises people. They expect something more impressive. But love, when it's steady and unglamorous, rarely looks impressive from the outside. If I could speak to the woman I was on that wedding day, sitting there as a room went quiet in the wrong way, I would tell her this: you will be okay. Not because someone will fix this moment, and not because you'll be vindicated publicly, but because this is where you begin to see yourself clearly. This is where you stop waiting for permission to take up space. I would tell her that dignity doesn't need to be defended loudly to survive. It just needs to be lived consistently. I think that's the part people miss when they hear stories like mine. They expect a triumphant confrontation, a dramatic reversal, a moment where the offender is shamed and the hero applauded. But real life rarely offers clean arcs like that. What it offers instead is something quieter and more lasting, the chance to step out of patterns that no longer serve you. The father-in-law who insulted me at the wedding is gone now. The words he spoke don't echo the way they once did. What remains are the lives shaped in spite of them. A sister who learned to mother with gentleness. A child who grew up knowing love doesn't require dominance. A woman who finally learned to see herself as worthy without proof. I raised my sister alone. That will always be true, but it is no longer the headline of my life. It's one chapter written with care and exhaustion and hope, and then closed when it was time to turn the page. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this: you don't need to be recognized by everyone to be whole. You don't need your sacrifices to be understood by those who benefit from them. And you don't need to harden yourself to protect your worth. You just need to know it deeply and quietly and live from that place. There are rooms you will walk into where people see you clearly, and there are rooms where they never will. Your job is not to perform until they understand. Your job is to decide whether you belong there at all. I stayed at that wedding. I spoke my truth without tearing anyone down, and then, slowly, I built a life where that moment no longer defined me. That is the kind of ending I trust now. Not perfect, not loud, but honest. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever carried more than your share and wondered if it mattered, know this: it did, and so do you.